Today I'm here with Whitney Airgood-Obrycki, a senior research associate, the project manager, and the lead author of America's Rental Housing Report from the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University. So before we get into a discussion, I again just want to say thank you for reading with me. My first question is, what is your journey so far? How did you get to where you're at right now and your interest in affordable rental housing?
Sure. I've had an interest in neighborhoods and housing issues for a long time, but I think really the journey that brought me specifically here was I did my PhD in city and regional planning at Ohio State University. I went in really interested in these questions of neighborhood change dynamics and especially the expansion of suburban poverty in particular. But through coursework and through a focus on housing, I really learned about the complexity of housing policy, and especially the challenges that low-income households face, as well as the dire shortage of rental assistance and just how complicated layering those programs can be for the agencies that manage them. I was lucky enough to work with a faculty member there who was working on a project on public housing authorities, and I think I completely just got hooked on research and on this field. Just found that I absolutely love working with data. Really appreciate the opportunity to research something that's impactful. And now at the Joint Center, I get to work on reports that I read as a graduate student, and I really get to, shape discussions and share research with stakeholders in a way that it can be used effectively.
Kind of what you just talked about, how there's so many different aspects that come together. How do these areas intersect when we're talking about policy, affordability measures, the market, and then also with the suburban neighborhood change? I'm interested in how that kind of goes along with what you're doing.
Yeah, so I think affordability is really at the core of a lot of my research interests and a lot of the work that I do. And I found that it's really hard to explore affordability issues without thinking about how we measure that challenge, how market conditions can produce those challenges, and then what policy levers we can actually use to help alleviate them. And so those pieces intersect really well, and you kind of can't do one without the other in some ways. And then when you start to think about what people can afford and where those opportunities are, the context of neighborhoods, often comes up. And I'm especially interested in these geographies of exclusion, how that contributes to enduring patterns of racial and socioeconomic segregation that we see across the country that's shaped by our housing landscape. I think the case with research is that once you start going down one avenue, one question always leads to another and another and another. You start to see how all of these dynamics are really linked together, and you can't think about one thing without, all the rest. And when I think about housing challenges now and how we can address them, I really think that that's the case of it, right? Is that all of these challenges are different, but they're interrelated and they're complex. And so once you start picking apart one thing, you start to see everything else is related to it. And it becomes really hard to separate issues of like affordability with neighborhoods, with the dynamics of change over time.
We're talking about how affordable housing is a major topic, like you said. And you focus specifically on affordable rental housing, it seems. Is that right?
Yeah, I almost exclusively study rental housing and rental programs.
Based on your experience, how do you think the landscape of affordable rental housing might evolve over the next few years?
One of the big trends we're seeing now is that growing on affordability and really in places across the country that might have been more affordable previously and into demographics that might have not struggled with affordability as much is really pushing more places to do something about it. Like we've really reached the point of crisis, and it's something that people can't ignore. And so there seems to be this greater realization that we need to use all of the tools at our disposal, and more places are willing to take action on it. When I think about the affordable housing landscape for rental, the federal resources are so important. It has a scalability, it has a reach that you can't quite get at the state and local level. But we also, on the other hand, just haven't seen a big expansion of that rental assistance to meet what has just been absolutely enormous growing need. And so I think that's also part of what's pushing, more cities and states to think about this and to take action. So right now, what we see is that there's a lot of momentum in the housing space, which is really exciting. And I think that is probably going to be the landscape going forward a little bit. There's momentum for zoning reform and regulatory relief just to make it easier to build, diverse housing types in a range of neighborhoods. We're seeing more places start to think about the different kinds of development models, including public development, to take more of the housing just out of the market. There's a variety of tenant protection bills coming up in places across the country. And then we have places that are starting to experiment with rental assistance programs after the pandemic programs expired, and just looking at different types of funding streams. So I think the landscape is once again that there's no silver bullet, but that there's a lot of momentum as this really has reached the point of crisis.
Given the diverse range of stakeholders that are involved in the housing sector, we have government, nonprofits, developers, and then residents, of course. What do you think is the best approach for building consensus and collaboration towards common housing goals? And I'm thinking about communities where there are a lot of people or some people who are kind of like the loud, smaller group, but their voice gets prioritized. What is your take on that?
I mean, I think it's a really big challenge, right? It's a really big question. I'll say from what we do as our sort of position as a research center, and as my position as a researcher, is that a lot of what we're trying to do is give people data and evidence, and to do it in as balanced a manner as possible, so that you can sort of take it at face value, and you can use it to support these different progressive policies, and to really like highlight the challenges that people face. I think what we do in some of our own work is, when we work on our reports in particular, we spend a lot of time trying to understand the perspectives of diverse stakeholders in the housing system, and just trying to make sure that their concerns and the issues that are top of mind for them are reflected in the stuff that we're doing, and the data work that we're doing, the reports that we're writing. So we end up with a lot of people in rooms that don't necessarily agree. There's always competing interests, right? So if you have an apartment association and you have people who are advocating for low-income renters, they aren't necessarily always going to be aligned. But it does help when you start to have these conversations, and you can go beyond some of the stereotypes about people, about landlords, and sort of recognize that there are these nuances and complexities, that everyone that's really in this housing space is facing different sorts of challenges and constraints that need to be considered. And if we want to move forward, we have to do it together to some extent. And so that's certainly been our approach, is to say, let's understand the concerns of different constituencies, and let's try to create a balanced approach to how we're presenting data in these discussions.
In the past few years, we've seen the buzz for planning topics like affordable housing and missing middle housing and urbanism make its way into online spaces like social media. And it seems like it's turning into an interest-driven topic for a lot of people who don't have any previous knowledge or background in planning, but they still choose to advocate for topics like affordable housing. Why do you think that is becoming more popular over the past few years?
I think one of the pieces of this is that affordability is more of a problem up the income scale. So it's affecting more middle income and even higher income renters, and across broader geographies than it has ever before. So we saw massive increases in cost per units during the pandemic. We saw that, in rural areas and large metros. You can, one of the stats from the report that we had this year was that Louisiana and New Jersey have the same cost burden rate, right, at the state level. And so you just see this become a national problem, and a problem that's affecting more and more people. So I think as it impacts more people's lives, it's pulling them into the conversation, and it's making it more imperative that people have some kind of understanding of this issue. And my hope is that, even, this is terrible that we're in this sort of crisis state, but it also puts us at a moment where it might be possible to gain support for addressing this through policy, through zoning reforms, and that we can really leverage what seems to be this growing constituency and this growing interest to get more solutions in place right now. That this is actually an opportunity as we pull people into this discussion.
Planners Day on Capitol Hill is coming up on June 12th. And planners are going to be able to advocate for federal action on equitable housing and zoning reform. So how do you feel planners should communicate the value and importance of taking federal action on zoning reform and affordable housing?
I think housing is a platform for everything else, right? Affordable housing is is a crucial life-changing platform for improving the financial well-being of households, for improving their health and their stability. It's central to everything. I think we really learned that during the pandemic. When we think about what these solutions are, then we really need diverse and affordable housing options in a range of communities, right? To ensure that everyone can not have to pay too much on housing so they can meet a comfortable standard of living, to make sure that people can live and then age in the communities where they choose, and also to just improve the economic vitality of our communities. If everything is going to rent, people aren't going to be able to pay for anything else and contribute to local economies to eventually become homeowners to save for retirement. So there are all these downstream effects of not addressing this problem right now. But first and foremost, for the sake of people's lives and well-being, housing is a crucial platform, and affordable housing is desperately needed right now.
Finally, do you have any resources, tips, or anything else that you would like to share with planners and anybody else who's just interested in housing issues?
Well, I'd love to plug some of our signature reports, of course. The State of the Nation's Housing is an overview of both homeowner and rental markets and the key issues that are happening each year. It's a report we write every single year, comes out in June usually. It's a great basic overview of housing issues and housing policy for those who are interested in that. Covers things like demographics, market dynamics, policy challenges, and then things like affordability for homeowners and renters. It's a great resource and a great entry-level resource as well. The report that I lead is America's Rental Housing. There was just an iteration that came out in January of this year, and it's really just a deep dive on rental markets, on the state of renter households in the country, and is also a good sort of entry-level resource. And then there's a third general report that I think people might be interested in called Housing America's Older Adults, and that specifically looks at the challenges of housing an aging population. And the effect of older adults on housing markets as well. So yeah, and I encourage people to subscribe to our blog and everything else. I think one of the things I like about the Joint Center is it's generally pretty accessible data and research. We try to do things at the local level where we can, and we do try to provide as many good resources as possible.